Hi, everyone. My name is Evan. I am a doctoral student in the philosophy department here at the University at Albany, and I am also the current president of the University at Albany Mind Studies Association. This is our first real active semester, the fall 2020 semester, that is, as an organization, so you're really getting in on the ground floor here. Unfortunately, before I made my introductory comments for the talk that you're here to watch, I didn't press record. So my introductory comments and a very, very, very tiny part of Dr. McClamrock's talk were cut off at the beginning. So I'm just re-recording them here now. I'm not re-recording the beginning of his conversation, but I am re-recording my own comments just as a little explanation for why it starts in the middle of a sentence and a little bit about our organization. So first, the University at Albany Mind Studies Association is a registered grad student organization here at the University at Albany. And the organization is designed to bring students together, graduate students across departments who are working on research or interested in issues related to the mind. Our goal is to foster interdisciplinary dialogue, education, and collaboration on topics including, but not limited to, artificial intelligence, moral psychology, consciousness, perception, language, reason and rationality, music and animal cognition, and neuroethics. While we are a grad student organization, faculty and interested undergraduates are always welcome to attend our events. You can find out more about our events by following us on Twitter. That's at UAlbanyMind, or if you're a student at University of Albany, by joining our listserv. And you can email UAMSA@albany.edu to find out how to do that. And the format for the talk was that there was a 30 minutes allotted for the talk, and then 30 minutes followed by an open Q&A. We had someone fielding questions through the chat, and you'll get to see those at the end as well here. So finally, let me just provide the introduction that I did provide that got cut off for Dr. Ron McClamrock. He is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and Program in Linguistics and Cognitive Science here at the University at Albany. Before that, he received his PhD in philosophy at MIT. He works in the philosophy of psychology, including the foundations of artificial intelligence and cognitive science, as well as more broadly in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. He is the author of Existential Cognition, Computational Minds in the World, which argues for the centrality of interactivity with the world for a scientific theory of mind. It's a fantastic book. I have read it. I would hold up a copy for you to see, but it's in a different state for me right now. But I strongly encourage you to buy a copy if you're interested. He also teaches on and writes on higher level causation and explanatory pluralism in the sciences, bounded rationality, and the relationship between phenomenology and the sciences of the mind. And the title for tonight's talk is, as you've probably seen, Seeing Through Consciousness. And with that, we can get into the video that is a recording of that talk. And again, I apologize for having cut off the beginning of it. Hopefully you'll forgive me. It was on the first slide, so you can see what he would have said there. So without further ado, here is Seeing Through Consciousness with Ron McClamrock. Thanks.
Experiencing that was the recording message, right? Is the thinking of consciousness as a matter of experiencing thoughts as objects of consciousness, as opposed to thinking of consciousness as experiencing thoughts as conduits or modes of presentation or forms of consciousness. So I think that there's a kind of tendency to slide between these two ways of talking about consciousness and act as if things that we say about one automatically apply to the other. And I think that that's a pretty serious mistake. And what I'm going to do here is try to say kind of what that amounts to, what that really means to think there's a mistake there, and why I think these should be kept fairly different. and so why it's a problem. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some concrete places where I think this matters, where I think it comes up in kind of general arguments in the philosophy of mind, where making this mistake tips you one way rather than another, and that we should be correcting for that. So the plan to do that is this. I'm going to talk a little bit up front about perceptual constancy, because I think it's the law. I think I have to talk about perceptual constancy a little bit. And then after doing that, I'm going to bring in kind of the connections to intentionality and the intentionality of consciousness. Then I'm going to talk about the distinction between consciousness and meta-consciousness, which I think psychologists tend to like. Philosophers don't talk that way quite as much. And then I'm going to talk about some places where this whole kind of apparatus shows up in arguments. So that's what I'm going to kind of march through here in the 30 minutes. I think I'll probably more or less make it through. And when I get to places where it shows up, depending on how much time is left, I'll either, mention them and wave my hands, or I'll, rant a little about each of them. We'll see what happens. So that's the plan from here. That's the thing that I think is kind of the central theme of that everything I'm going to be talking about is going to revolve around, even if it's not totally, completely an argument about it. All right? Perceptual constancy. So perceptual constancy is one of these things that I think is just, hopefully just there for people who have any psychological background. I think that it's maybe not as well known and talked about outside of kind of cognitive psychology in general. I'll say a few words which will be remedial for those of you who are quite familiar with it. But if this isn't something that you've been around very much, I'll just mention. So perceptual constancy is a phenomenon of perception. It's the phenomenon of perception that is the fact that objects and their surfaces, say, the pencil that's there on the table now, or the book that's over there, these objects or surfaces are seen as constant in terms of their shape and color and whatever lightness over wide ranges of projected light on your eyes. So if I move the book, what I see when I move the book, first and foremost, is that there's a rectangular surface book that's moving around. I don't see it as 2D slices of it, the parallelogram that it projects here, or the almost trapezoid it projects here, or whatever. I don't actually see it as that way. In fact, I find it kind of a little bit hard to see those things. But what's really just given to me, whether I'm right or not, because, Cartesian demons or whatever, right? But what's given to me is it's given to me as having a certain fixed shape. And likewise for its color, when I move the surface of the book, and it's unfortunate in real life, if we were doing this, I'd have a book and I'd be moving it around. But if you do that on camera, it's very weird because camera distorts all these things. So for example, camera violates perceptual constancy in that normally when I move my hand around, my hand looks the same size the whole time. But when I do that, not so much, right? Cameras just screw up perceptual constancy for good reasons. All right, so anyway, that's the phenomenon. It's a kind of widely understood and discussed. There's some details about it that people worry about. That's the phenomenon of perceptual constancy. Seeing something other than those three-dimensional shapes is actually like seeing the thing that would show up in a photograph from here if you were kind of coloring on the photograph. The 2D shape that it projects, or the lightness that the book is showing right this second, those are things that actually tend to be sort of strangely hard to do. That's why drawing is hard without training. You can't kind of get that quite right. When I do this in a class, I often ask people I show them a book on the table and I ask them to fold a piece of paper so that it forms the kind of trapezoidal, maybe parallelogram-y thing that the book has from their angle. And the point of that is that nobody does it well except for the bizarre occasional person who's had an enormous amount of training in how to do that. I'm going to see if I'm going to try to switch this over and give you an example here about that hardness. Very familiar example, well known, and probably more than a few of you have seen it, and more than a few of you have seen it from me probably, and that's the Adelson checkerboard. So, you know, in the Adelson checkerboard, you see this thing. It's really clear that you decode it as a checkerboard. There's a little bit of shadow cast by the green cylinder sitting on it, but it's pretty clear and straightforward that that's how you see it. You see these things, but actually the 2D, or now lightness function at the level of particular squares here is, if you'll notice, I didn't change those two square colors when I put that bar in, but now it's clear that they're absolutely the same gray. Those are just the same surface properties there. Let me see if I can go back. Yep. So if you go back and you focus on one, I'm not changing them. So what's unavailable to me, what's, if you like, invisible, is the surface property. What's utterly visible is what I take it as. I take it as a dark square, the one above, and I take the one below as a light square, right? So there you go. All right, so there's the example. Let me flip us back to, there we go. So you should be back on, is that working okay? We're back on the regular, the good overhead? All right, the one with text. All right, so moral of the story. Do we see the projected shape? Do we see the thing that's the same between those two squares? Well, in the most straightforward sense, we actually don't, right? We just don't see it. We see it as the three-dimensional distal thing that's being portrayed, dark square, light square, and the 2D proximal ones are often not seen at all, but maybe we can figure them out by putting a bar between them or holding things up to them or things like that. There is maybe another sense in which we do, which you might say, well, look, we see through the available projected light to the represented features. That, in that sense, we are seeing them, but not as things, not as objects, merely as conduits to the representation of the distal array there. All right, so there we go. Perceptual constancy and sort of what we do and don't see. Now I want to talk about how that kind of lines up with some issues about intentionality. So intentionality of an act is what it's about, its directedness. Philosophers are all going, yeah, get to the point. So yes, that's what intentionality is about. It's about the directedness of acts on objects in the world. And so when we actually describe our experience, it's almost all intentional, right? We go, oh, it's, you know, you wanted me to tell you about my current conscious experience. It's the experience of sitting in a chair in a certain way, looking at a screen. You know, that's how I describe it. I describe it thoroughly intentionally. I don't have access to anything like the little patches of light or anything. I mean, I kind of know it's light there and a little darker over there, but really what I describe for you in describing my experience is intentional. And of course, you know, Fregean sense put the intentionality of mental states front and center. And I will say that the phenomenological tradition totally jumped on that. Husserl was a lover of Frege and thought that what he was doing was just an expansion on that intentional theory of the content of our thoughts. So a little bit about the intentionality of two kinds of conscious acts. So I want to differentiate between first order conscious acts and reflective or second order or meta conscious acts. So first order conscious acts are conscious acts that we engage in that are about the world, right? They're about surfaces and things and people. I'm thinking about the table in front of me. I'm thinking about the person over here. That's their aboutness is things in the world. Of course, we can be wrong, but that's what they're about. Whereas second order or reflective or introspective acts of consciousness are about your own experiencing. They're about, so I think about the bag of cookies that's sitting there just in case I need them. And then I think about my thinking about it. That's what we do. It's philosophy, right? So we take a different object in that second act, right? We take the object of my experience as the object, and that's the thing we now see. But in first order experience, that's not what we're doing. We actually take the objects in the world as objects. That's what I see, just like I saw, the surface properties of the squares in the Adelson checkerboard. So when we talk about consciousness and representation, there's a sense in which, remember the Adelson, there's a clear sense, I think, in which in first order consciousness, we aren't conscious of representations. That is, we aren't conscious of them as object in any sense. We don't see them as representations. We see through them to things that we see as dark surfaces or light surfaces in the world, or square things or whatever. We see through. Now, in the phenomenological tradition, there's a tendency to label this kind of consciousness of something non-thetic or non-positional. And so I sometimes will lapse into saying that kind of thing. I'm not sure it's super helpful. When were the terms that phenomenologists pick ever super helpful? Never. But still, you will hear me say it and it'll come up a couple more times. But the idea is just, in first order consciousness, we aren't conscious of representations qua object, right? We are only conscious through them, whereas in second order consciousness, we're conscious of our acts of representation as objects. Now, in first order consciousness, the representation is like the lightness projected, just seen through rather than seen as a kind of object. I will say there are a good handful of people who are here who are taking my seminar this semester where we're talking about illusionism. And of course, the illusionists would balk at that point and say they actually don't take something as object in quite that way, but that's their problem, not mine. So just a flag for those of you who might have gotten confused because you're in the seminar where we're talking about it. All right. So we've got this idea of, so I use perceptual constancy to kind of get this idea of seeing through versus seeing the thing. I talked about the difference in intentionality between the two kinds of consciousness. First order consciousness, where the intentional directedness is toward the world. Second order, where it's toward representations of the world, or roughly something like that. So now I want to talk a little bit about the consciousness meta-consciousness gap. These are all supposed to line up in a way. And the consciousness meta-consciousness gap here is trying to illustrate the ways in which the epistemic status of first order consciousness and second order consciousness are extremely different. And they're different in a variety of ways, and people who kind of take the distinction very seriously will take different positions about them. But I will say that this is the difference in epistemic status between these is the kind of thing that I think psychologists historically have been much more inclined to kind of go, oh, very different here. So I think in general more in touch with this kind of idea that there's a really fundamental difference in the epistemic status of what we do when we engage in conscious acts versus what we do when we engage in metaconsciousness. So let me give you the great crossover artist of philosophy and psychology, William James, who said about this 130 years ago or so. So let me see if I can get that one to share as well. Excellent. There we go. All right. So this is my one quote for the day. I know it's long, but it's pretty good, and it's James, so you know, what the hell. So James says, "We find ourselves in continual error and uncertainty so soon as we are called to name and class and not merely feel about our own internal states," right? When we have to classify, we're in this position. Introspection is difficult and fallible. We may go astray and give a description more applicable to some other sort of thing. And then he labels this idea that connects with this, the psychologist's fallacy. He says, "The great snare of the psychologist is the confusion of his own standpoint as, you know, doing this second order thing, right? His own standpoint with that of the mental fact about which he is making his report. The psychologist stands outside of the mental state he speaks of, the first order consciousness that he speaks of. He ordinarily has no other way of naming it rather than as the thought, percept, etc. of that object, that he describes them in terms of their intentional directedness, and that's kind of what you got, right? He himself, meanwhile, knowing the self-same object in his way, gets easily led to suppose that the thought, which is of it, knows it in the same way in which he knows it, although this is often very far from being the case. That is, that my knowledge of that how I grasp the thought and how my first order thoughts of it in reflection versus my first order thoughts, they probably don't line up so well. And finally, another variety of the psychologist's fallacy is the assumption that the mental state studied must be conscious of itself as the psychologist is conscious of it, acting like first order consciousness has to embrace already a self-consciousness. The mental state, first order mental state particularly, is aware of itself only from within. It grasps what we call its own content and nothing more. It, as I was saying, sees through to the world rather than seeing itself as object in any way. All right, so let me go back. There we go. All right, so James thinks that there's just tons of error in introspection, that he's waved his hands at reasons for thinking that there's a lot of error like this. And this is, of course, a kind of thing that's echoed in contemporary discussion of, as it's sometimes called, metacognition, where we're thinking about the contents of our own states, where we try to figure out ways in which these things go wrong. And a lot of data has been offered over the years, so we miscategorize experiences. So even though we have a really good stimulus, if we've been led to think something odd, we will miscategorize and then go, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't the right category of even the taste of the thing, as opposed to just the wrong category of the distal object. Or we miscategorize things about their painfulness. So I've often given the anecdote about this, that I broke my ankle many years ago playing basketball. When I started to come back, I was so hyper vigilant that every time something happened around my ankle, like my socks would shift a little when I was out trying to play again, I'd go, oh, it hurts. And then a second later, I'd go, nope, I misjudged that. I misjudged the character of my experience there because I had this anticipation going, right? There are just tons of others I'll just mention briefly. So studies on arousal and judgment. There's a tendency for people to deny that they're feeling arousal when it's by something that they have a judgment they shouldn't be aroused by, even though it seems pretty clear that they're not, at least in some cases, not actually systematically trying to lie to you about it, nor are they just not experiencing the arousal, but just getting physiological symptoms. There's experience sampling studies that take a look at mind wandering. So, when you're doing something boring, like reading a boring passage or listening to a boring talk even, when you're doing something boring, your mind can wander. And so it turns out that if we use experience sampling, where something will just beep at you once in a while and you have to go, what was I doing right then? Turns out that our minds wander way more than we think they do. That is, our introspective judgment about wandering is pretty bad, even though we're right there to tell, because we're not turning our metacognition toward the wandering there. And finally, I'll just say first order skillful discriminations without meta-awareness. So there are lots of kinds of cases where people can make really good, subtle discriminations in kinds of objects or kinds of sentences uttered and that sort of thing, with really very poor ability to introspectively judge that they are making the distinction, much less what the ground of the distinction is. So all of that is kind of psychological stuff about it that's in conflict, of course, with some traditional philosophical views. In particular, it's in conflict with what we sometimes call the traditional Cartesian account of self-knowledge. Whether this is actually Descartes' view or not, I leave to people who actually know something about Descartes, but we call it that, we have infallible knowledge of the character of our conscious experience, that it can't be wrong, or a view that I sometimes call the Yankee phenomenology view, the idea that the right way to think about our consciousness is as constituted by and explicable in terms of infallibly known qualia, that qualia are the kind of the paradigm of conscious experience, and that they are utterly and completely known, that there's nothing about them other than what you can know about them. Both of those kinds of views are in pretty serious conflict with this. And both of those are kinds of views that are going to encourage you to push together consciousness and metaconsciousness in a way, because there won't be this epistemic gap between them of, what things you can know well and what things you can't. You'll be absolutely in contact with the qualia, which then you introspectively know absolutely certainly. So these kinds of traditional philosophical views, which I think are opposed to the kind of data that I sort of laundry listed for you here, these are things that, if you are buying this idea that there is this kind of significant consciousness and metaconsciousness gap, that there's a retranslation, if you like, sometimes people say, into your metaconsciousness judgments that isn't just using the same intentional form that was there for your worldly judgment, that when you do that, you are introducing, of course, lots of possibilities for error. And in general, the fact that there are these errors encourages you to keep separate these two classes, which is what I was saying before. That is, I want to keep these classes as robustly separated as I can, because I think when you don't, you have significant problems. And so let me say something about that. So how are we doing here? 7:38, we started at 7:10. All right, I'll run a tiny bit over, but not horribly. But I don't have enough time to go into super depth about places where this idea will apply, but I'll give you a few and kind of wave my hands at the direction how this might bear on it. So I'm saying, applying the idea, please do see if this will work, and then you can write a paper and have a hit with it. I don't know. So let me say a little bit about that. So if you don't slide between objectified and non-objectified consciousness, if you don't kind of go, oh, they're kind of, in the end, they're pretty much the same idea, how might that matter? Well, here are a handful of issues in contemporary philosophy of mind and philosophy of psychology where I think this distinction kept robust will push one way or another in how we should think about these. So here's the list for you to work on and see if you can get this to help. So first of all, externalism and 4E cognition. So the idea of a kind of an externalist view of mind, that what state of mind you count as being in isn't just a function of narrowly conceived brain state, but of your embedding in the world, 4E, because it's embodied, embedded, enactive, and extended. Different ways of talking about how your situatedness in a body and a world affect what your cognitive states are. Of course, if you think that our kind of first and foremost way of thinking about consciousness is first order consciousness, and look, I think that normal life is first order consciousness most of the time. Okay, philosophers probably do second order more than they should, and but I think that first order consciousness is our normal consciousness. It's only the odd case where we pull ourselves out of it. And in first order consciousness, of course, because you're not thinking of the conscious state as something that's to be thought of as an object that you know the properties of, but rather merely a conduit through which the world is presented in a certain way. Of course, the idea that the conduit shape has to be only in your head rather than a function of how the world works as well, there's actually no particularly good reason to think that unless you have maybe empirical reason to try to draw the line differently. So that is seeing through content to the world. You're not seeing the content, you're only seeing through it. And which parts of seeing through are constituted by activities in your brain and which part is constituted by activities in the world, that's something that you shouldn't expect to have any particular introspective access to. Mark Rowlands is somebody who really pushes this idea, and he says, I have a little quote from here. He says, if intentionality is a conduit rather than an object for us, the 4E views of it are obvious and banal. Now, that might be a little bit strong, but the idea that once you allow that these things are really just conduits, drawing the line at the skin or at the edge of the brain or whatever seems less appealing, I think. So I think it's a plus for the 4E cognition. I think it's a plus for the views that say the content of consciousness overflows judgment. You know, this is a view that I think you see people argue. So Dan Dennett is a kind of famous case of this, but there are plenty of other people who say that consciousness, the content of consciousness doesn't overflow judgment at all. It's just what we judge about consciousness, and that's all there is to it. And of course, seeing things in the way that I've suggested here makes that seem exactly like the wrong way to think, that the content that we have and the judgments we make about it should be kept robustly separate in the ways that I've suggested. Neural correlates of consciousness. So you see a lot of talk about finding the neural correlates of consciousness, right? And to the extent that you're talking about second order consciousness, maybe, okay, I'm so anti-reductionist, I'm finding it hard to even say this, but I will say it, maybe that's kind of plausible, that you might think that there are distinctive mechanisms that go into doing reflective judgment about your states in general, and that's what underlies the idea that consciousness has at least reflective consciousness has a kind of global workspace attached to it or something like that. But the general idea that there should be specific neural correlates of consciousness seems far less plausible if you think that normal consciousness is distributed engagement with the world, visual, auditory, whatever. And so this would lean you the other way. Minus-ish for Libet like timing and choice examples. So these examples that are supposed to show that brain potentials for particular actions occur before your consciousness of the urge or awareness of the choice to do the action. Of course, if you think that the consciousness that matters is not my reflective knowledge that I'm going to do the thing, but my actual engagement with trying to do the thing, then of course you might think that it comes noticeably earlier than my reflective judgment about it. And so the kinds of things, there are lots of worries about the limit kind of cases, but there's one that you can point out grounded in this. And finally, one more, a minus for higher order approaches to consciousness. So there's a kind of view that in philosophy of mind that you might have heard about, the idea that what makes a state conscious is that it's an object of another state, that and it's not even that the other state was a conscious one, right? It's that's what makes it conscious, to be the object of another state. And of course, if you think first order consciousness is paradigmatic consciousness, it's the consciousness that we have lots of the time. And frankly, it's the consciousness that dogs probably have all the time, and they're really conscious. So the idea that what makes something conscious is being the object of some other thought seems completely wrong on this view. And let me just say, frankly, I don't have any idea how the being conscious of another thing makes the thing you're conscious of conscious. When I'm conscious of a table, it doesn't make the table conscious. It makes me conscious of the table. So I'm not sure that, I mean, I think higher order consciousness, higher order thought views about consciousness are problematic anyway, but I think if you take this view, even more problematic. Okay, there's my laundry list. I'm gonna finish now, just last word, and then I'm done. So here's a last thing. So maybe I should have just said, you know what, don't mix up consciousness and self-consciousness, okay? And maybe you might have, that might have been enough. And okay, I'll say that, don't mix up consciousness and self-consciousness. However, I think that the problem is that there are a lot of arguments around consciousness and philosophy that run them together or put too much of self-consciousness into consciousness, so that the idea of being conscious of our representations is assumed when you talk about consciousness, and then we give the paradigms of introspective consciousness instead of going, but you can't assume consciousness of representation when you're talking about consciousness, because first order consciousness just isn't like that. But I think there's a tendency to slip between these. My illusionism friends in here, you know that this has been coming up over and over again in there, where they have a tendency to think, introspective consciousness is an illusion, and then they try to infer from that there's no kind of object-oriented consciousness like that, that is consciousness of our own states, a Cartesian theater that we're conscious of. Then they act like that means that there's no thing to say about what it's like, or that there's no phenomenal consciousness in general. And that's a result of running these things together. Consciousness in its first instance, first order consciousness, is directedness, not object. That is, oh, you knew I was going to say it, right? If you know that I like this. Consciousness really is nothingness after all. Well, sort of nothingness. That is, it's not a thing that we see, it's a thing we see through. It's invisible in that way. So it's kind of like nothingness, sort of, well, at least part of it is, maybe. And that's where I think I'll leave it. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Ron. If anybody has any questions, just go ahead and write question in the chat here, and we'll put you in line. All right, Scott, let's start with you. Scott, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
So, Ron, I was thinking about higher order evidence and whether or not you thought Suppose that I take evidence. I take the testimony of a friend that a book is square instead of my own perception of the book. Right? Maybe because we're on Zoom and they're looking at it in a different room. Would that count as would my perception of that evidence count as higher order consciousness, because there's sort of like a level of there like even if it's my my immediate perception of my sort of the world from their testimony, it's mediated by their perception of the book, right? Or is there some other way of thinking of our perception of higher order evidence, right? Where it counts as like some sort of like weird like third level or something like that, or
I'm not quite sure what the answer is. Let me say, so I think that when I talked about higher order thought here, I didn't want to talk about evidence per se. I think evidence is like Quinean and holistic, and anything can count for anything and all of that. But I think the case that you mentioned here, so what should we say about your thinking about the book at that point? And you're thinking about there being a book there and having properties. Seems to me there are a couple of things. One is clearly you don't have first order visual consciousness of the book. But you do have, it seems, thoughts that are about the book rather than about Evan. Sometimes you think about Evan, sometimes you think about the book, sometimes you think about the little picture of Evan on the screen. That's fine, you can think of all of those, but just because it's secondhand doesn't mean it can't be, its intentionality can't be directed at the object, and your thought should be thought of as an object. In the same way, I take it that I can think about the book that's sitting right over there when I close my eyes and think about it. I don't have to have first order experience of it. But here I wasn't worrying so much about evidence and more about kind of the character of the experience itself.
Okay, nothing else from Scott? We'll go to Gunnar. Gunnar, unmute yourself and speak on up.
Hey, let's see if I can frame this correctly. So I guess my question is, where on the spectrum of using the I guess just the terms of self-consciousness and consciousness, do you place experiences that seem to be within my perception, but not necessarily available to my first order consciousness? So I'm thinking here of cases where it seems like there's evidence that take really elite athletes who, a baseball player hitting a ball that's just coming at them at an unbelievable speed. It seems as though if you wanted them to reflect on that, on their first order experience or first order consciousness of that, there are certain things that they're perceptorily aware of just given what they're able to do, but it's just totally unavailable to what's actually going on self-consciously. Does that,
No, I 100% agree with that. That's the kind of thing that I had in mind when I sort of went through the consciousness, metaconsciousness distinction. That's the kind of thing I had in mind in that last entry there, which was really good first order. So they can read a curveball, right? And it's kind of unbelievable, but they can't tell you typically much about that. They can, and they may actually be unaware that they systematically drop their bat a little bit in response to certain things. That might be, even though they're conscious of the variables that are here, they have no knowledge of doing it after. I use an example in class sometimes, maybe some of you have heard me use this example that's a lot less rarefied than the awesome athlete one because we can all do it. And that's the distinction that we are really good at making in language between two words that are spelled S-O-M-E. And so the distinction between the two meaningful things, or two meanings attached to it at least, the two meaningful things are that you sometimes pronounce the word some, and you sometimes pronounce the word sm. And when you pronounce it sm, it means something specific. And you probably didn't notice this. It wasn't available to your reflection, but you were really good at registering it. And the difference is, of course, that some versus sm, when you use sm, you normally use sm with a mass noun, and you normally use some with a count noun. So, so you could say, there's some water over there, right? And you would say, there's some chair over there, right? So notice I said them differently. And the place it shows up, in fact, it's at the core of jokes that are funny, but partially because we don't think about it, is that, and now I'm going to ruin it for you, are jokes that go basically like this. So there's a guy who comes to the door, and the people inside, they interact with him, and he's big and muscular and handsome and charming, and they turn to each other and say out of his earshot, "That's a man there." Now notice by saying sm, they've gotten you to act as if like he's a mass noun, right? Quantity of something. There's a quantity of man there, right? And of course we disambiguate with it, right? Because chicken is a word that can have both a count noun and a mass noun reading. And notice the difference between there's some chicken on the table and there's some chicken on the table. You're good at that. Everybody is, but just utterly unaware of it. In the baseball case, probably no equivalent of a linguist is going to come along and point this out to them and have them go, "Oh yeah, now I get it." And it's kind of remarkable how bad people can be at introspecting on their highly skilled engagement with the world.
And just to follow up, so, and the term for that you were using is, give it to me again.
So in that context, I was talking about it as in the context of consciousness versus meta-consciousness or meta-awareness. But I think that these things all kind of reinforce the same distinction. It's an intentional one and an epistemic one. So I think they reinforce the same one.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's nobody left in the queue. If there's anybody that would like to, Brad, go ahead. Ask your question. Unmute yourself.
Thanks, Ron. I thought that was really fun and interesting. So I have a question about this kind of fallibilism with respect to self-knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So you say that we're wrong about the attributions of self-knowledge with respect to consciousness.
Sometimes, right.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But what about with respect to just propositional knowledge generally, or propositional attitudes generally? I mean, is this the fact about just that we're just fallible, or is it something that's specific to consciousness?
Yeah. So, I'm picking on consciousness because I think it's a place where historically people have denied that fallibility. So that's why I was focusing on it. Of course, I think we're fallible about everything pretty much. In fact, I think we're fallible about absolutely everything. But when you say about propositional knowledge, so you mean, am I saying that we're fallible about whether we possess? So
we think we believe that it's raining outside. So we take it that we know that we believe that it's raining outside.
Yeah. And so can I be fallible about whether I actually believe that it's raining outside?
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So it's not just consciousness.
Yeah.
The problem with consciousness that's explaining that.
I think consciousness is the place where people would be most inclined to dig in and say, no fallibility, right? I mean,
right.
Kind of Descartes did. And so So that's why I was picking on it, not because it doesn't happen generally, but because I think the tendency has been to make consciousness kind of an exception. Okay, I can be wrong about whether I hate my dad, I can repress it, whatever, but I can't be wrong about whether I feel X right now, right? So that's the thing I was resisting.
Right.
So
Because I mean, some people do think that we're infallible about our mental states, leaving aside consciousness, but it seems like you want to extend it to that.
Oh yeah, I think we're not infallible about our mental states. Yes, yeah. By the way, when Brad pointed out to me that sounded a little Wittgensteinian, I thought, oh, that's nice, and I had a little moment there. I thought maybe I should do the whole talk in the style of Wittgenstein. Everything is an aphorism,
Right?
And I wrote one Wittgensteinian aphorism for the talk, and then thought, no, that's a bad idea. But as we leave, I will leave you with my one Wittgensteinian aphorism.
Nice.
Always nice to have some Wittgensteinian jokes. Next would be Rachel. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, so Ron, you almost answered this question already in part in your response to Brad, but I wondered, it's notorious that people are terribly fallible about their own emotions. And I just wondered whether you thought that was there's a further level of fallibility there, or whether that's just in general that emotions like sense perceptions and other kinds of conscious states are really, we see through them, and that it's the same kind of fallibility that when we try to have second order consciousness of our emotions, we just go wrong in various ways. So would you say it's parallel, or is it? So I'm asking you to extrapolate.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I do have a view about it, so you're right. It seems like when you're thinking about my experiences, the things that people are most willing to kind of, even if they're a little hesitant about the fallibility about consciousness, they'll probably go with, okay, maybe emotions, right? Because I can experience anger but not really know it as anger or something like that. Although, people who are really dug in will say, no, right, yeah, as you probably know better than I about emotions. But yeah, I think that it's very similar, and my view about this is partially the view that that I got when I read Sartre's Emotions Outline of a Theory, because he has this great bit about, whatever Sartre is good for, and not everything clearly, but whatever he is good for, he is good at a certain kind of phenomenological description of things. And he says, remember that first and foremost, most of your emotional states do not take you as an object. They take that as an object. It's Peter who's despicable, not me who's a hater, right? And that's the character of an enormous amount of our emotional content. Are there completely free-floating things that you don't want to talk about that way? That's an interesting question. But our normal everyday, that is desirable, and that is despicable, and that is something to be feared. And so I think that in a way, the first order is the most basic there as well. So I think it does line up.
Thank you, Rachel. Next will be John Mandel, but before we go to John, Nick Lisyuk, thanks for doing that Passion of Barney. Ron, I think if you can see that, I think that'd be one of your next memes that we should keep.
No,
Thanks,
I'm not seeing it. Where
Nick Lisyuk, one of our 111 students.
Yeah, I made the Passion of Barney. That's why I asked about Barney today.
Oh, the Passion of Barney. Whoa, look at that. Hey, that's pretty good. That actually looks a fair bit like Barney.
And now everyone's going, who's Barney? Okay.
My cat.
I have to come to more talks about it.
Go
ahead, John. Unmute yourself. Go ahead.
My cat's way too lazy to get on camera, though.
I'd like to hear more about one of the implications that the lessons that we should draw. And you mentioned this, I think it was in connection with Dennett. So I'm not asking specifically about Dennett, but I want to know how you're thinking about judgment.
Yeah. So let's see. I think that, let me give it a try and you can like jump in and steer if you want. So I'm thinking about judgment about consciousness as often involving us taking it as an object and placing it under a category. So we categorize the experience as having, you know, an emotional quality or having shape properties or having, and we place it under some kind of concept or category. So I think that that's what we're doing when we engage in this kind of judgment. So people like Dennett here want to say that everything that counts as being conscious is something that has been in some way conceptualized in my judging about my experience.
So I'm not sure about the judging. I wouldn't want to say it's judging about experience, but I would think you would want to say that we see through our concepts. So I see that cat, right? And so I'm deploying the concept cat not as a further step, but as part of what I'm perceiving. So is that like a further judgment?
So you're absolutely right. I do want to say we see through our concepts to the world. And then what we try to do is we try to take those concepts that we've been looking through and reapply them to our own experience and say, that's a cat experience there.
Oh, I see.
And that's what becomes tricky. And that's the kind of thing that, say, you know, Place talked about in the phenomenological fallacy, as if there was a, you know, that what's first and foremost is this thing that we have the intimate internal acquaintance with. And the secondary thing is the concept as applied to the world. Yeah.
So really, Dennett thinks that?
Yeah, it's a right. It's a you know, he's definitely going for this kind of. I mean, now that I'm doing the illusionist stuff in my seminar, so they all think of him as the founding father of illusionism, and so he thinks anything that isn't that is just bullshit that you made up. And so there's no kind of fact to the matter about it. And this is all just overlays of different judgments that we have over and over again. Yeah, he thinks that. It's kind of a weird view. But, you know, my views about Dennett have always been, I mean, I like Dennett. He's a terrific writer and he's fun to read. But whenever he has a substantive view, I always think, you know, you can see his Rylean roots just coming right through, right? I mean, he was a Ryle student.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah, and it just shows here as well, right?
Thank you, John. Next on the list is Evan Malone. Go for it.
Yeah, so I have like, I think half of a question. I don't really know. It's not fully formed, but
I'll only give you half of an answer then.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I was wondering if you'd given any thoughts to how this distinction might have import for conversations about aesthetic experience. You know, so I know like one of the things that people say about design is that good design disappears. Like you don't notice it, and like a scratchy pen, you'll notice it. You know, and also there's I was just reading a passage from Artist Experience or Aesthetic Experience, Artist Experience by Dewey, and he talked about how aesthetic experience has this sense of completion that's kind of like self-reflective, right? Where you realize, oh, hey, this has been building to this moment. And on that view, it seems like I don't know if that helps his view to make this distinction or not, because he does complain that most of our everyday experience is not aesthetic, and that's the problem, and that's why it stands out to us. But I don't know if you had any thoughts about the import of what you've been talking about for aesthetics.
Yeah, so there were two things there, and so I have a view about one of them, and the other one I really just don't know what to say about, and I hope that you will figure it out and tell me what to say about it. But the first one is this thing about good design disappears and things like that. You know, I think that that's so compatible with this kind of view that the point of good design is to show you the world a certain way rather than to show you what a clever designer I am. I think that there's something absolutely right about that, and that fits with this whole idea of, you know, seeing through not seeing. But as for the Dewey thing and there being a kind of culmination moment of the aesthetic, wow, I'm not sure what to say. My intuitions actually don't go that way out of the gate. It seems like a lot of the best aesthetic experience I have is somewhere I'm super engaged with the world and not in any way acknowledging of the pinnacle of it. If I think what's the kind of best musical experience I've ever had, it's when I was probably in best practice playing really well with people who were just the right level and we were all hitting, and I wasn't going, we did it. I was going, I was just in it, right? So, and you know, that's kind of the flow thing, right? So I don't know what to say about the second one. So I was right, I gave you half an answer.
All right, there's nobody else on the queue, so if anybody else has any questions, feel free to.
I think Colby just.
Oh, yep, Colby, go ahead.
So my question has to do with, I guess what I'll phrase as, or how I think about as creative imagination. So if I have a creative thought, something that I think I could probably reasonably say is something that I've never experienced in the world, right? Some kind of original image I can picture in my head, let's say. Where does that fit into this view of consciousness? I am conscious of this thought, right? But it's not something I can say I've ever seen. It's never something I've, by your definitions, I would say I could, it's something I've never experienced through first order consciousness. I think that's right, at least on your definition. So where would creative imagination like that fit in?
Yeah, so good question. Let me give a two-part answer, and this time I think I have both parts. So part one of that is, of course, it's not a requirement that there be an object of a certain sort for you to have first order awareness directed at such an object, right? I mean, I could be hallucinating, I could be fooled by a virtual reality, whatever. The thing that makes it first order consciousness isn't that there's an actual thing necessarily, but that its character is the viewing through rather than the viewing of. So the fact that there's no such thing in the world, that's not the roadblock. But sort of imagination and kind of imagining things is kind of an interesting case for this. I don't have a really deep view about it, but I will say that, so I mentioned Sartre's view about emotions, and of course he, one of his early books when he was still like, you can make a lot of sense of what he said because the meth problem wasn't too out of control and stuff. One of the kinds of things that he emphasizes that he thought that even imagination should be thought of this way, that the things that we conjure up aren't in any sense objects in our minds. They are directedness at the world, but things that don't exist. So he had that kind of view, would push it to the max. My guess is that the right thing to say about this is that there are ways in which we imagine things that are a lot more like first order consciousness. There are ways that we imagine things that are very second order, where we really are thinking of the thing in our head as opposed to thinking of the world as possibly containing one of those things. And I think there probably won't be a kind of a systematic, just it's one or the other. Imagination will turn out to be a mongrel concept probably, but hey, all concepts are mongrel concepts, is my view.
All right. Since we are technically at time, we'll take one last question, and that will be back to Scott, who started us out. Go ahead, Scott.
So, Ron, in your answer to that last question, you said something that made me think about first order consciousness a little bit differently. So you said that it's, you described the looking through as the character of, or that being the character, that first order consciousness has the character of looking through. If that's right, then it seems like cognitive biases, literally all cognitive biases, should be thought of as something we're conscious of. Because so if you think about just about any like system one bias, system one driven bias anyway, right, then it's going to be something that basically filter, right? You can think of it as like an information filter that presents the world in a certain way to us. And that's why it's the case that we have things like actor observer biases and things like that, right? That's the reason why I think that the printer is out to get me when it jams, instead of just thinking that, or the previous person who used it must have been an asshole who, left it jammed instead of me having misused it, right? But normally when we think of these biases, it's very common for us, controversially, no doubt, but we typically think of them as unconscious. Is it the case that this is a problem for thinking of first order consciousness as seeing through, or is it the case that you think we should see this as a problem for the way we normally think of cognitive biases?
Well, that's an awesome question. So I think that the answer is, so on the one hand, I did not ever say or intend to imply here that that nothing could be contentful and unconscious. I'm totally open. I think that's probably true, and so it could be that lots of these biases are just unconscious, and that's really all there is to it. But I do think that thinking about first order consciousness in this way does encourage you to think that there might be a lot more that's first order conscious stuff that isn't unconscious. And I think this comes up. So again, I will go to my good friends, the phenomenologists, about this and say, so I think that this shows up in kind of Heideggerian contexts where he talks about basically, I'll not use his examples, but things like the unself-knowing racist, right? Who genuinely, seriously denies that they're a racist, but they see the world through that filter. And that just seems like a perfectly understandable thing that makes them, in a certain sense, conscious. So I think it's open that there could be a lot more conscious there than you thought. I will say that, of course, Sartre's view in Being and Nothingness was that, in fact, everything that you ever thought was unconscious is really conscious in this way. And that's why he basically rejected Freudian repression, right? He thought, you don't need repression, you just got bad faith. We see it under the, so I see my dad under the despicable description, not me really, but I see my father under the despicable description, but it's in my second order consciousness where I just tell myself lies about it. I engage in bad faith about it. So Sartre definitely was pushing to make all the things that we would have counted as unconscious in that way first order conscious, even though they aren't second order conscious. And it's not just that they're lying about it, that really their second order consciousness is that that's not what's happening at the first order. So yeah, I think it has the opportunity to push more in the direction of more consciousness involved in such implicit biases, which personally I think is probably right.
All right, so unfortunately, that looks like all the time. That was our last question. So I just want to thank everyone as quickly as I can before my dog starts barking again, and for coming. Like I said, we have other talks coming up with Jason DeCruz from the Philosophy Department and Brendan Gazer from the Psychology Department. So again, if you're interested in finding out about those, there should be instructions in the chat about how to subscribe to our listserv. So,
and there I'll leave you with my one Wittgensteinian aphorism for the talk.
Excellent.
That's pseudo-Wittgenstein,
Yeah.
the little-known younger brother of the two known Wittgenstein brothers, later Wittgenstein and early Wittgenstein. Right.
That's pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Great.
If
This
you
was a
guys
lot
have
of
any more
fun.
questions, just let us know at uamsa@albany.edu. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Ron.
Ron.
Really fun.
Excellent.